Top 55 plus ReactJS interview questions and answers. Top 55 plus ReactJS interview questions and answers. For experienced developers. 1. What is the virtual DOM and how does React use it? The virtual DOM is an in-memory representation of the real DOM. React diffs the new VDOM tree against the previous one and applies the minimal set of real DOM. Updates. Reconciliation. To improve performance. 2. Explain reconciliation and keys in React. Reconciliation is React's algorithm for diffing VDOM trees. Keys help React identify which children changed, were added, or removed. Stable keys, not array indices, are essential for predictable updates. 3. What is React Fiber? Fiber is React's reconciler rewrite that enables incremental rendering, interruption, and prioritization of updates, enabling features like suspense and time slicing. 4. What are controlled versus uncontrolled components? Controlled components have their value driven by React state via value plus on change . Uncontrolled components maintain internal DOM state accessed via refs default value . 5. Explain the rules of hooks. Hooks must be called only at the top level of React function components or custom hooks, and only from React functions. No conditionals or loops. Follow the naming convention use asterisk . 6. When to use use effect versus use layout effect . Use effect runs after paint. Non-blocking. Use layout effect runs synchronously after DOM mutations but before paint. Use for DOM measurements or to avoid flicker. 7. Describe use memo and use callback . Use memo memoizes computed values. Use callback memoizes function references. Both avoid expensive recomputation or unnecessary re-renders when dependencies are stable. 8. How does use ref differ from state? Use ref provides a mutable container that persists across renders without triggering re-renders. When mutated, use it for DOM refs or mutable values you don't want in state. 9. What is use imperative handle ? Used with forward ref to expose imperative methods from a child component to the parent while encapsulating internal implementation details. 10. Explain forward ref . Forward ref passes a ref through a component to one of its children. Useful for HOCs or function components that need to expose DOM nodes. 11. What are error boundaries? Class components that implement component did catch plus get derived state from error to catch rendering errors in descendants and display fallback UI. Hooks cannot be error boundaries. 12. Describe suspense and lazy loading. React. Lazy plus suspense allow code splitting components and showing a fallback while the component or data is being loaded. Server-side suspense capabilities exist in concurrent, experimental builds. 13. What is concurrent mode, and why does it matter? Concurrent mode, experimental, allows React to pause, resume, and reuse work, improving responsiveness. It enables features like transitions and non-blocking rendering. 14. How does React handle events? React implements a synthetic event wrapper for cross-browser compatibility and uses event delegation. at the root to improve performance. 15. Explain state batching in React. React batches multiple state updates into a single render pass, synchronously in event handlers in modern React. Async updates, promises, timeouts are also batched in modern React. 16. What is a higher order component? Hockey. A function that takes a component and returns a new component with added behavior, used for cross-cutting concerns, e.g., logging, data fetching. Hooks often replace many hock use cases today. 17. What are render props? A component pattern where a prop is a function that returns UI, enabling sharing logic between components. 18. How to optimize re-renders. Use !react, memo !, use memo !, use callback !, split components, normalize state, avoid anonymous props, and keep components small and focused. 19. Explain React, memo. !react, memo !, is a hook that memoizes a functional component, preventing re-renders unless props change. Shallow comparison by default. 20. When to use Context API versus Redux, MobX. Context is great for passing theme, locale, auth etc. across the tree. For complex, high-frequency updates or large state graphs, a dedicated state manager. Redux, Zustand, MobX. With performance, patterns may be better. 21. What are the pitfalls of context? Context changes trigger re-renders in all consumers. Keep context value stable. Memwise. And split context to avoid unnecessary updates. 22. How would you structure state in a large app? Normalize entities. Collocate state. Local where possible. Separate UI versus domain state. Use derived selectors, memoized selectors, and use well-defined data flows. 23. What is server-side rendering, SSR, and hydration? SSR renders HTML on the server for faster first paint and SEO. Hydration attaches React event listeners to server-rendered markup to make it interactive. 24. What is streaming SSR and why is it useful? Streaming SSR sends HTML chunks progressively, allowing the browser to render portions of the page faster. Useful for large pages and progressive loading UX. 25. Explain differences between Next.js, Remix and client-only React. Frameworks like Next.js provide SSR, SSG, routing, API routes, file-based conventions, and performance optimizations. Client-only React is pure SPR and lacks built-in SSR, routing conventions. 26. How does code splitting work in React? Tools like !react, lazy !, dynamic !import, and bundlers, Webpack, create separate bundles that are loaded on demand to reduce initial bundle size. 27. What is tree shaking? A bundler optimization that removes unused exports from the final bundle. Reducing size. Requires ES modules. 28. How to handle forms in React. Use controlled components for validation and predictable updates. Or use libraries like React Hook Form, Formic for performance and simpler validation flows. 29. Explain optimistic updates. Update UI immediately assuming a successful remote change. Then reconcile if the server responds with success or rollback on error. Improves perceived performance. 30. What are portals? Portals allow rendering children into a DOM node outside the parent component hierarchy. Useful for modals. Tooltips. Overlays. 31. How to prevent memory leaks in React components. Clean up subscriptions, timers, and async operations in use effect cleanup or component will unmount. Cancel in-flight requests. And avoid setting state on unmounted components. 32. What is reconciliation priority and scheduling? React assigns priorities to updates. Interactive versus non-interactive. And schedules work accordingly, enabling higher priority updates to interrupt lower priority ones in concurrent mode. 33. Explain React DevTools profiler use. The profiler shows component render times and re-renders. Use it to find performance bottlenecks and unnecessary renders. 34. How to handle accessibility, R11Y, in React. Use semantic HTML. ARIA attributes when necessary. Focus management. Keyboard navigation. And testing tools, Axe, Lighthouse. To ensure accessible UI. 35. What is component composition versus inheritance? Composition. Props, children, HOCs, render props. Is the recommended pattern to reuse code and behavior. React avoids inheritance for component reuse. 36. How to test React components. Use unit integration testing with React testing library, Jest and E2E testing with Cypress or Playwright. Favor user-centric tests. Queries by role, text. 37. What is hydration mismatch and how to fix it? A mismatch occurs when server-rendered HTML differs from client render. Fix by ensuring deterministic rendering. Avoid random IDs. Non-deterministic data during SSR. And use consistent environment-specific logic. 38. Explain get derived state from props and why it's generally discouraged. Static lifecycle used to derive state from props. It's error-prone and often unnecessary. Prefer controlled props, memoization, or derived values in render. 39. When to use class components today. Function components plus hooks cover most needs. Class components are only used for legacy code bases or when error boundary capabilities are required. Hooks cannot be error boundaries. 40. What are custom hooks and best practices? Custom hooks encapsulate reusable logic. Naming use *. Keep them composable. Avoid side-effectful shapes leaking implementation. And memoize returned values when appropriate. 41. How to handle global side effects, e.g., analytics, in React. Centralize side effects in a single layer. Middleware. Effect handlers. Or use a custom hook, context and ensure idempotence and cleanup. 42. Explain the difference between use effect dependency pitfalls and stale closures. Stale closures capture old values. Include all dependencies or use refs to hold latest values. Or memoize callbacks to stabilize dependencies. 43. How do you implement pagination and infinite scroll? Use cursor-based pagination for scalable APIs. Debounce, throttle scroll events. And use virtualization. React window, React virtualized. To render only visible items. 44. What is virtualization and why use it? Virtualization renders only visible list items to reduce DOM nodes. Improves rendering and memory. Useful for large lists. React window. React virtualized. 45. How to secure React apps from XSS. Avoid dangerously set inner HTML or sanitize input. Use frameworks escaping for templates. Validate data on server. And store secrets securely. Never in client bundle. 46. Explain component profiling and diagnosing re-render issues. Use React Profiler. Record commits. Examine why a component re-rendered. Props, state change. And reduce re-renders by memoizing and splitting components. 47. What are strategies for server state, data fetching, in React? Use libraries like React Query, SWR for caching, deduplication, revalidation, background refresh, and improved UX with features like optimistic updates and retries. 48. How do you deal with large CSS style in React? Use modular CSS. CSS in JS. Styled components. Emotion. Cautiously. Beware bundle size. Critical CSS inlined for SSR. And CSS variables for themes. 49. What is hydration streaming and partial hydration? Partial hydration hydrates interactive parts of a page progressively rather than the entire page, improving time to interactive on large SSR pages. 50. Explain difference between SSR, SSG, ISR, Next.js. SSR. Render on request SSG. Generate at build time. ISR. Regenerate pages on a schedule or request to combine freshness with static performance. 51. How to implement internationalization, I18N, in React apps. Use libraries like React Intel or I18 Next. Keep locale files separate. Lazy load language bundles. And externalize strings for translators. 52. What are design patterns you use in React architecture? Container, presentational components. Or hooks plus presentational. Atomic components. Feature modules. And domain-driven component boundaries. 53. How to handle real-time updates, WebSockets, in React. Centralize socket connection in context or custom hook. Clean up on unmount. Debounce updates to avoid flooding renders. And normalize data. 54. What is micro frontends and how does React fit? Micro frontends split frontend by feature, teams into independently deployable apps. React apps can be federated, module federation, or embedded with iframes with careful contract design. 55. What debugging strategies do you use for production React issues? Use logging and observability. Sentry, LogRocket, source maps, feature flags for rollbacks. Reproduce locally with minimal repro. And memory, profiler snapshots for leaks. 56. Bonus. How do you design for maintainability in React? Enforce consistent patterns. Linting. Typing. Small focused components. Docs and tests. Modular folder structure. And prioritize readability and explicitness. Thank you. Hope this helps in your React interview prep. Subscribe for more.